Get out! What the hell does a black single father know about medicine? Elena Hargrove screamed straight into Jamal Thompson's face, in front of dozens of contemptuous stares. In his hands was nothing more than an old metal brace, something the entire medical system had stamped as meeting proper standards. And at their feet lay evidence that had been hidden for many years, the pain of a child who had been labeled normal, end quote. But just a few seconds later, when Jamal bent down, loosened exactly one point, and rotated along exactly one axis, the entire room fell silent. No money, no drugs, no top experts. Only a child standing up, no longer groaning in pain. It turned out Jamal was not a lucky amateur. He was a father who had taught himself orthopedics to save his own son, a man who understood pain-stricken bodies more deeply than anyone else in the room. And Elena, a billionaire woman accustomed to giving orders, cried for the first time like a mother. If you were Jamal, would you lower your head in silence to keep your job, or stand tall and speak the truth in front of those with money and power? Follow the channel and leave a comment. Do you stand with truth or money? Detroit never sleeps. This city breathes through the sound of engines, through metal grinding against metal, through a relentless rhythm of life, powerful enough to swallow anyone who falls out of step. By day, it wears the facade of wealth, of glass buildings reflecting a gray sky. By night, it reveals its true form as a people-crushing machine, where those with money walk straight ahead, and those without are forced to bow their heads. In Detroit, a person's worth is often measured by what they own, not by what they endure. The luxury car repair garage nestled itself within a gleaming commercial district. Inside, cold white lights shone down onto concrete floors stained with oil and grease. Jamal Thompson bent beneath the undercarriage of a Rolls-Royce, his back rigid, his hands coated in grime. The car was so polished, it reflected his face each time he shifted. Position, a sun-darkened face, dulled by exhaustion. He had worked here long enough to be accustomed to the smell of hot metal, long enough to understand that he was merely part of the background, nothing more. "Hurry it up!" Vic barked from behind him, his voice dry and sharp. "These cars are worth more than your life." Jamal did not reply. He tightened his grip on the wrench and adjusted the bolt's position. Beneath the car, the dull clanking of metal echoed, blending with the hiss of an air compressor whining in the corner of the garage. It was a sound he heard every day, so familiar that sometimes he forgot he was even breathing. A white man stood nearby with his arms crossed, his expensive suit free of even a speck of dust. He leaned forward to look at Jamal the way one might look at a tool. "Don't let this guy touch the interior," he said to Vic, half joking, half serious. "I don't want the smell of trash in my car." Vic chuckled faintly and nodded it off. Jamal heard every word clearly, but he only wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and kept working. His calloused hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fatigue. Those calluses were the marks of years spent bent over, of long nights working overtime to afford rent, to afford medicine for his son. He pulled himself out from under the car and straightened his back for a rare moment. Pain shot through his spine, a familiar ache, like a reminder that his body also had limits. Jamal took a deep breath, the smell of oil filling his nose, pulling him back into the present. In that moment, another image intruded, so vivid it made his chest tighten. He remembered the cold courtroom from years ago. His wife lay on a stark white hospital bed, her breathing fading after the collision. The car had come out of nowhere in the rainy night, driven by a drunk young man from a wealthy family. Jamal remembered the boy's face in court, hair neatly styled, suit perfectly fitted, a faint smile as the lawyer read out the figures. Figures large enough to turn guilt into a settlement. When the gavel came down, the boy turned and smiled, as if he had just escaped an inconvenient exam. Jamal stood there, fists clenched, helplessness pressing down on his chest like an invisible weight. "Jamal," Vic called, snapping him out of his memories. "Don't just stand there spacing out." Jamal nodded and returned to work. Those memories never truly left him. They simply waited in silence, slipping back in whenever he paused for too long. Late in the afternoon, Jamal left the garage, his work jacket still carrying the smell of oil. The neighborhood where he lived was not far away, yet it felt like a different world entirely. Old buildings, windows shut tight, streetlights flickering, police rarely appeared, unless someone was being handcuffed and taken away. Jamal's apartment was small and narrow, but tidy. His son sat in a chair, his legs motionless on a thin cushion. The boy looked up when he heard the door. "Are you tired today, Dad?" he asked softly, as if afraid of adding to his father's burden. Jamal stepped closer and rubbed his son's head. "I'm okay," he said in a low, steady voice, "just a little worn out." The boy nodded, his eyes still following him. Jamal turned away, went into the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. In that cramped space, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing clearly on his shoulders. He was both father and mother, the sole protector of that child. Every passing day was a fragile balancing act between rent, medicine, and his own dwindling strength. That night, he adjusted the small brace on his son, checking each strap and every joint. These were skills he had taught himself from old books, from scattered videos online, from watching doctors at work. Not because he believed he was gifted, but because he had no other choice. He watched his son sleep, his face peaceful in a brief, fragile rest, and silently promised himself that tomorrow he would stand up again. The next day, the garage was as noisy as ever. Vic paced back and forth, checking progress, his eyes never leaving the expensive cars. Jamal returned to his work, slipping back into the familiar rhythm. Another Rolls-Royce was brought in, its glossy paint reflecting the overhead lights. Vic leaned close to Jamal's ear, his voice lowered but heavy with threat. "You need this job," he said. "Remember that." Jamal looked up at Vic, his expression calm. He said nothing, but the words echoed in his mind for a long time. In this place, employment was a favor, not a right, and that favor could be withdrawn at any moment. An engine suddenly roared to life as another car started up. The sound was powerful and dense, vibrating through the concrete floor, drowning out Jamal's breathing. He stood there, wrench still in hand, feeling the vibration travel up through the soles of his feet. In that moment, he felt small. Before the machine called Detroit, a man easily replaced, easily forgotten. Then the garage door burst open. Light from outside flooded in, bringing with it an unusual silence. A pristine white Rolls-Royce Cullinan rolled in slowly, majestically, as if the entire space were required to yield. The workers in the garage stopped, all eyes drawn to the vehicle. Jamal stood frozen, a chill running down his spine. The car came to a halt in the center of the garage, the engine cutting off, leaving behind a heavy stillness, like a verdict just pronounced, marking the beginning of something he could not yet comprehend, but instinctively knew would change everything. The Rolls-Royce Cullinan came to a complete stop in the middle of the garage, its white paint reflecting the overhead lights so brightly that the already cramped space felt oddly displaced. The engine shut off, and with it, the usual noise disappeared as well, as if every sound had been drained away. The mechanics froze, all eyes turning toward the vehicle. Jamal stood at the edge of the garage, a wrench still clenched in his hand, clearly sensing the shift in the air. This was not the kind of car that came by for ordinary repairs. It carried something else with it, something that made the entire place bow its head. The car door opened. Elena Hargrove stepped out first, her stride decisive, each step landing on the concrete like a silent declaration of power. She removed her sunglasses, her gaze sweeping quickly across the garage, pausing just long enough for everyone to understand that they were being assessed. Jamal saw only a woman accustomed to giving orders, her eyes holding no curiosity, only the certainty that everything around her must operate according to her will. "My car must be fixed immediately," Elena said, her voice clear, not loud but strong enough to echo through the space. No mistakes. Vic almost sprang from where he stood, hurrying forward, his back slightly bent, a strained smile appearing on his face. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice smaller than usual. "We'll take care of it right away." At that moment, Arthur Blackwood emerged from behind Elena. He did not need to say much. He simply stood there, his hands loosely folded in front of him, his manner so polite, felt cold. Arthur's eyes did not linger on the car, but instead studied the people in the garage as if recording every movement. Jamal briefly met that gaze, a look that carried no hostility, yet made others feel measured. Lily was wheeled down from the passenger seat. The girl sat in a wheelchair, her body leaning slightly forward, orthopedic braces clamped tightly around her legs. The metal, dull and worn, the straps frayed. As the wheelchair rolled over the concrete floor, a faint scraping sound rang out, metal against bone, dry and sharp, enough to make Jamal frown slightly. Lily curled inward by reflex, her hands gripping the armrests. Her face was pale, beads of sweat dotting her forehead, even though the garage was not hot. Jamal noticed it, and his gaze stalled. It was not the look of a curious onlooker, but the look of someone familiar with pain that goes unnoticed. Elena did not turn back to look at her daughter. She focused her attention on Vic and the car. "I don't have time," she said, her tone sharper. "You understand." Arthur leaned in, speaking close to Elena's ear, his voice just loud enough to be heard by her. "Dr. Thomas did the best he could. This is the optimal solution." "Yes." Elena gave a slight nod, as if the words merely confirmed what she already believed. She turned to Lily, her voice lower but no softer. "The child has to endure pain," she said, "as long as she has a future." The sentence fell into the garage like a heavy object. Jamal heard every word clearly. He looked at Lily and saw her lips pressed together, her eyes wide but dry. There were no tears, no resistance, only a resignation that had become a habit. Jamal recognized that look, the look of someone who had learned to endure rather than wait for help. Vic motioned for Jamal to come over. "You take this one," he said quickly, his voice low but firm. "Be careful with every detail." Jamal stepped closer. The reduced distance allowed him to see the braces on Lily's legs clearly. The joints were misaligned, the angles unnatural, the straps tightened far more than necessary. He did not need to touch them to sense that something was wrong. A familiar feeling rose in him, like the moment he had seen his son's first brace many years earlier, just as rigid and misguided. Lily turned her head and caught Jamal's gaze. She looked at him for a brief moment, then quickly looked down, as if afraid of being noticed. Jamal gave her a slight nod, a small gesture, almost unconscious. His grip tightened around the wrench, his knuckles turning white. "Elena," Arthur spoke up, his tone even, "we should let them work. A bond over." Elena nodded and turned away. "I'll stay here," she said. "I want to see everything happen." Jamal bent down and began working on the car, but his focus was no longer complete. His ears still caught the sound of metal scraping against bone whenever Lily moved. Each time the sound echoed, he thought of his son, of the nights the boy clenched his teeth to keep from crying out in pain. The images layered over one another, slowing Jamal's breathing. Vic walked past and glanced at him. "Don't look around," he whispered. "Do your job." Jamal did not answer. He returned to working under the car, but in his mind, the image of those braces remained vivid. He knew that type of design, knew its consequences. It did not help with recovery. It forced the body to adapt to pain, day after day, until pain became a normal state. Elena stood a few steps away, speaking briefly on the phone with someone, her voice never lowered. Arthur stood beside her, silent, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Lily. The girl remained still, her hands clenched, her breathing shallow and rapid. A bead of sweat slid down her temple, but she did not wipe it away. Jamal pulled himself out from beneath the car and stood upright for a moment. He looked at Lily again, this time longer. Everything inside him aligned into a clear, straight line. The way her feet were positioned, the joint angles, the body's reaction under pressure, these signs were not random. They pointed to a single conclusion. That brace was wrong. Wrong in structure, wrong in design philosophy, wrong in a way that made the wearer pay with prolonged pain. Jamal knew it as clearly as he knew his own heartbeat. He turned away, but the feeling did not leave him. Arthur stepped closer to Elena, his voice low. "We shouldn't stay here long." Elena nodded, but her gaze briefly passed over Lily, then paused for a very short moment on Jamal. A moment so brief it was almost imperceptible, yet long enough for Jamal to catch the wariness in her eyes. She did not know what it was, but she sensed that something was no longer under her control. Jamal returned to his work, the steady sound of the wrench ringing out. But inside him, a thought had already taken shape, clear and impossible to erase. Those braces did more than cause pain. They were doing something far more wrong, and he knew that sooner or later the truth would be forced into the open, no matter how great the cost might be. The garage started running short on people from the middle of the afternoon. One worker asked to leave early because his child was sick, and another was sent out to deliver a car. Vic stood in the middle of the concrete floor, glanced at the job list, then stopped at a white Rolls-Royce Cullinan. He turned to Jamal, his voice sharp and pressing. "You do this one. One scratch, and you're done." Jamal looked up, quickly scanned the car, then nodded. He knew what his choice was. Here, silence was the condition for continuing to exist. He pulled the toolbox closer and adjusted his gloves. Pressure hung suspended in the air, heavy enough for everyone to feel. This was Elena Hargrove's car, and even the smallest mistake was enough to cost someone their job. Arthur Blackwood stood a few steps away, arms crossed over his chest. He said nothing, but his eyes followed every movement Jamal made. It was the kind of supervision that needed no reminders, the kind that kept the person being watched permanently in a lower position. Jamal felt it, but he did not turn around. He bent down under the car and began working in his familiar rhythm. On the other side, Lily sat in a wheelchair, leaning slightly forward. Every time she moved, the sound of metal from the brace rang out, dry and harsh. A short sound, but enough to make Jamal's hands pause. Lily let out a small groan, her hand gripping the armrest tightly, her knuckles turning white. She tried to stay quiet, as if afraid that the sound of her pain would bother the adults. Jamal slid out from under the car and glanced at Lily again. He slowed his steps, as if weighing something. Arthur shot him a warning look. Jamal understood, but a question still slipped out, small and low, just loud enough for Lily to hear. "Since when has it hurt?" Lily looked up, seemingly surprised that someone had asked. She thought for a moment, then answered in an even voice, "It always hurts. They say that's normal." The words hit Jamal like a heavy object. He clenched the wrench, his jaw tightening. "Pain isn't something to get used to," he said, his voice low and steady. "The body isn't made to endure like that." Lily looked at him, her eyes flickering for a moment, then dropped her gaze again. She had heard comforting words before, but no one had ever spoken to her like that, direct, without detours. Jamal turned back to the car, but his mind was no longer there. Old images flooded back, his son in bed, the times the boy bit his lip to endure. The feeling made his chest heavier. "Elena," Arthur spoke up, his voice soft but clear, "perhaps we should let him work." Elena, who was standing on the phone, turned her head, her cold gaze sweeping over Jamal. "Mind your own business," she said, without raising her voice, but firmly re-establishing order. "Don't interfere in matters that don't concern you." Jamal nodded and said nothing. He bent down and continued working, but every time Lily moved, he heard that scraping sound again. The brace held her leg at an unnatural angle, the weight distributed incorrectly. With every roll of the wheelchair, pressure was driven into her knee joint in a way that caused prolonged pain. He could see it clearly, like looking at a drawing set on the wrong axis. Arthur stepped closer, his voice low. "You were hired to fix cars," he said, "not to diagnose." Jamal looked up, his eyes meeting Arthur's for a brief second. "I'm just looking," he replied calmly. "Anyone can see it." Arthur pressed his lips together and said nothing more. He turned away, but his eyes continued to track Jamal. Vic walked past, glanced at both of them, then tapped lightly on the car's body. "Hurry up," he said. "Time is money." Jamal worked faster, but not hastily. Every movement was precise, because he understood that a single deviation could make everything collapse indifferently. In his mind, the details rearranged themselves into a logical sequence. The way Lily sat, the way her body reacted, the way the brace locked her joints. That pain did not come from illness. It came from a design that forced the body to endure instead of supporting it. Elena ended her call and stepped closer to Lily. "We'll be leaving soon," she said decisively. "I still have things to do." Lily nodded, but her hand remained clenched. Jamal saw it, and a familiar sense of helplessness surged up. He knew he was standing on a fragile line. One wrong sentence could cost him his job, but silence also meant turning his back on what he had recognized. Arthur signaled for an assistant to prepare the wheelchair. Elena turned away without looking back. Jamal lifted his head, his eyes following Lily as she was pushed toward the door. With each rotation of the wheels across the concrete floor, the sound of metal rang out again, as if reminding him of what was happening. Before Lily completely left the garage, Jamal spoke one more sentence, quiet enough that only she could hear. "If it hurts too much, say something. Don't keep it inside." Lily turned back and looked at him, her gaze lingering a little longer. She did not answer, but that look carried something like hope, thin and fragile. Elena stepped outside, and the car door closed. The Rolls-Royce rolled out of the garage, leaving behind a heavy emptiness. Jamal stood still, feeling the silence return, but different from before. He looked down at his hands, then toward the door Lily had just passed through. If you have ever been looked down on because of your background, stay. Comment, I do not stay silent, and follow the channel. Jamal returned to his work, but his mind had already gone far beyond this concrete floor. He knew he had just seen something that should not exist, and that truth would not leave him alone. Somewhere out there, Lily was enduring pain that was called normal, and he understood that the moment Elena drove away, leaving the girl behind in that pain, was only the beginning of a chain of events that no one in this garage could have anticipated. The garage door closed after the Rolls-Royce drove away, leaving behind an unusual stillness. The familiar sounds of machinery gradually returned, but the rhythm was no longer the same. Jamal stood beside the car that had just been repaired, his hands still smeared with grease, his eyes fixed on the space where Lily had disappeared moments earlier. He knew he should have gone back to work, should have treated everything as finished right there. But his body did not obey that familiar command. In a corner of the garage, Lily was still there. Elena had left in a hurry, entrusting the girl to an assistant to take her out to the car afterward. But a small snag arose, just enough to create a few empty minutes. Arthur was on the phone outside, and Vic was busy handling another vehicle. There were no watchful eyes, no shouted orders, only the distant hum of the air compressor and the heavy breathing of a child trying hard to remain silent. Jamal slowed his steps, each one taken as if weighing the consequences. He knelt in front of Lily, bringing himself level with her eyes. Lily looked up, her gaze a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. Jamal lowered his voice, low enough that no one else could hear. Do you trust me? The question made Lily freeze, not because of its content, but because of the feeling of being asked. She was silent for a few seconds, then nodded very slightly. Tears welled up without a sound, rolling down her pale cheeks. Jamal saw it, and his heart sank. He understood that those tears did not come from physical pain, but from the fact that, for the first time, someone was treating her pain as something worth listening to. I'm going to touch the brace, Jamal continued, his voice steady and firm. If it hurts too much, tell me right away. Lily nodded again, her hand tightening around the armrest of the wheelchair. Jamal placed his hand on the brace, feeling the tension in the straps. He did not rush. He recalled every step he had taken with his own son, remembered how the body reacted just before pain appeared. He loosened the first strap, very slowly. Lily shuddered slightly. A small sound escaped her throat, then stopped. Jamal continued adjusting, gently rotating the joint axis. The movement was so small it would have been almost invisible to an outsider, but to Lily, it felt like a wave passing through her body. She let out a brief, sharp cry, then suddenly fell silent. Her eyes widened, her breath coming fast in her small chest. How are you? Jamal asked, stopping his hand immediately. Lily did not answer right away. She closed her eyes, as if checking something inside herself. A few seconds passed, longer than any moment before. Then she opened her eyes, her voice trembling. It's gone. Gone what? Jamal asked, even though he already knew. The pain, Lily replied, as if afraid that speaking louder would make the sensation disappear. Jamal took a deep breath, keeping his hands from shaking. He checked the position of her foot again and adjusted the balance just a little more. These were movements he had performed hundreds of times, but never in circumstances like this. The garage around them was still noisy, yet everything seemed to recede into the distance. Here, there was only him and the body of a child that was, for the first time, being placed correctly. Try to stand up, Jamal said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and hope. She placed her hands on the armrests, slowly shifting her weight. Her shoulders trembled, her lips pressed tightly together. Jamal kept his hands close, ready to catch her, but not touching. Lily lifted herself from the chair, her knees shaking, her body tilting slightly. In that moment, Jamal could clearly see the struggle in every muscle of the girl's body. Lily was standing, not steady, not graceful, but standing. She gasped for breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her face was no longer twisted with pain. She looked down at her legs, as if she could not believe what had just happened. "It doesn't hurt," Lily said, her voice breaking with emotion. Jamal kept his expression calm, but inside him, a familiar feeling surged. It was the feeling from when his son had stood up for the first time without bursting into tears. A sensation that was both relieving and heavy, because he knew this moment carried consequences far greater than what was happening right now. "Sit down for a bit," Jamal said, guiding Lily back into the chair. "Don't rush." Lily obeyed, still looking at him, as if afraid that if she looked away, everything would return to how it was before. Jamal adjusted the brace one last time, tightening it just enough, then stepped back. He watched her body's response closely. Every breath, every small movement, everything was different from before. Footsteps sounded behind him, clear and decisive. Jamal turned his head instinctively, the sound of high heels striking the concrete floor, steady, unhurried, but carrying a familiar weight. He recognized the sound before he even saw the person. Elena stood at the entrance, her gaze fixed on the scene before her. Lily was sitting more upright in the wheelchair, her face still damp with sweat, but no longer contorted. Jamal was kneeling beside her, his hand still near the brace. The moment stretched on, long enough for every assumption to form in Elena's mind. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. Jamal stood up and turned fully toward Elena. He knew there was no way back. Lily looked at her mother, her eyes both anxious and bright. "Mom," she said softly, "it doesn't hurt anymore." The words echoed through the garage, simple and bare. Elena stopped short, her gaze shifting quickly from Lily to Jamal. Everything she had believed, every assurance she had been given, was thrown into doubt in that instant. Arthur came in from outside, sensing that something was off. He looked at Lily, then at Jamal, his expression darkening. Vic also stopped what he was doing and turned around, feeling that something was wrong. Jamal kept his voice calm. "I just made a small adjustment," he said. The child's body responded well. Elena took another step forward, her eyes never leaving Lily. She said nothing more, but that silence was heavier than any of her previous outbursts. Jamal knew that from this moment on, the story had shifted onto a different path. What he had just done was no longer a small gesture in the corner of a garage. It had become a point of contact with the truth, and that truth had just touched the very place that power could not afford to ignore. Elena froze at the entrance to the garage, her gaze locked onto the scene before her. Lily was standing unsteadily, but unmistakably standing, both feet planted on the concrete floor, her shoulders trembling slightly as she struggled to maintain balance. Jamal stood nearby, his hands lowered, ready to catch her if needed. No one spoke for the first few seconds. The sounds of machinery seemed to recede into the distance, leaving behind a thick, oppressive silence. "Get down, now," Elena said, her voice sharp and urgent. Lily flinched and quickly sat back down in the chair. Elena strode forward, her eyes moving from her daughter to Jamal, then stopping at the brace that had just been adjusted. "Who gave you permission to touch my child?" she shouted, each word falling like a hammer strike. Jamal stood straight, not backing away. "The brace is structurally incorrect," he said, his voice so calm that it startled a few people nearby. "I only put it back the right way." 8. Arthur stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Elena. He did not need to raise his voice. "You have no professional qualifications," Arthur said evenly, coldly. "You are putting her in danger." Jamal turned to Arthur, his gaze unwavering. "I have lived experience," he replied. "I have seen the consequences of things that are fitted wrong." Elena let out a short, sharp laugh. "You think you know better than doctors?" she said, her voice rising. "I pay millions of dollars to top experts to handle this." Jamal nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the information. "And your daughter pays with her bones," he said, each word slow and clear. "The pain does not come from the illness. It comes from the way the brace forces her body to endure." A low murmur spread through the garage. Vic, standing nearby, went pale and signaled to a mechanic to turn on the security cameras. The screen mounted on the wall lit up, replaying the past minutes from multiple angles. Jamal Neelyun loosening the straps, Lily reacting, then standing up, clearly visible. Nothing was obscured. "Stop that," Elena said, spinning toward the screen. "Turn it off." Arthur raised a hand, signaling the opposite. "Let it run," he said in a low voice. "This needs to be recorded." Jamal looked at Lily. She stood still, one hand lightly resting on the armrest, her face tense but not contorted. There was no groan, no familiar sign of pain. That silence, to those who had been here from the beginning, became unmistakably clear. "Elena," Arthur said, "you can see it. A moment of standing proves nothing. This requires professional evaluation." Elena turned back, her eyes sharp as knives. "Be quiet," she said to Arthur, then turned to Jamal. "You are a mechanic. You think you have the right to interfere with my child's medical equipment?" "I think I have a responsibility when I see a child in pain," Jamal replied. "I am not replacing a doctor. I am fixing what is wrong." Vic stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Mrs. Hargrove, we can explain." Jamal only, "Be quiet." Elena cut him off. "This is my matter." She crouched in front of Lily, quickly checking the brace, her hands trembling slightly despite her effort to stay composed. "How do you feel?" Elena asked, her voice lower. Lily looked at her mother, then at Jamal. "I do not hurt," the girl said, her voice small but clear. "It feels lighter." Those words made Elena pause. She straightened up and took a deep breath. "Stand up again," she ordered. Jamal raised a hand. "Wait," he said. "She just finished. Her body needs time." "Are you giving me orders?" Elena snapped, her face flushing red. "I am talking about safety," Jamal replied. "If you want to test it, do it slowly." Arthur stepped into the space between them. "This is crossing a line," he said. "You are putting Mrs. Hargrove in an unnecessary legal position." Jamal looked at Arthur. "The law is not standing here," he said. "Her body is." Elena turned back to Lily. The girl was still sitting upright, her breathing steadier than before, the signs that a mother accustomed to observing could not ignore. Elena turned to Jamal once more, her voice sharp. "Where exactly is the brace wrong?" Jamal stepped closer, pointing at the knee joint. "The axis is misaligned," he said. "The center of gravity is distributed incorrectly. The straps compress the soft tissue excessively. The body responds with pain." Arthur shook his head. "That is speculation," he said. "You have no data." "I have the body's response," Jamal replied, "and it is speaking clearly." Elena clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. "I paid for certainty," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Not for guesses from a mechanic." "Money cannot buy the truth," Jamal said, his voice lower this time. "It only buys silence." The body does not stay silent. The entire garage held its breath. The mechanics stopped working, and Vic stood rigid. The camera screen continued to run, replaying the image of Lily standing clear and undeniable. Elena stared at it once more, then turned away, her eyes reddening with anger and confusion. "That is enough," she said sharply. "This will be handled my way." Arthur nodded, stepping close beside her. "We will take her for another evaluation," he said, "at an appropriate facility." Elena turned her back and signaled for an assistant to bring the wheelchair forward. Before leaving, she turned to look at Jamal, her eyes a mix of fury and something else, a small crack in her former certainty. "You will hear from my lawyer," she said. Jamal remained still, offering no reply. Lily looked at him one last time, her eyes no longer filled with the panic they once held. As they left the garage, the space gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but the feeling of what had just happened lingered in the air. Elena stepped outside, her face flushed with anger, her breathing rapid. In that moment, she understood that money had just collided with something that would not yield, and that collision left aftershocks no one in this garage could afford to ignore. Elena stood in the middle of the garage, breathing hard, her face flushed with anger. Jamal's words from moments earlier still hung in the air like a cut that refused to close. She looked around and saw eyes deliberately avoiding hers, saw Vic standing motionless with his familiar bowed head, saw Arthur maintaining a silence that had lasted far too long. That silence irritated Elena even more, because she was accustomed to immediate responses whenever she gave an order. "Who do you think you are?" Elena said loudly, her voice breaking with rage. "Yuri, just a lucky black mechanic." The sentence fell onto the concrete floor and echoed back more clearly than she had expected. Vic lowered his head even further, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if searching for something to hold on to. The other mechanics stood scattered around the garage, none of them daring to speak. They were used to seeing power come crashing down on others, but they were not used to seeing it openly challenged. Arthur stood slightly behind Elena, not intervening. His gaze was cautious, watching Jamal, more than looking at Elena. Arthur understood that moments like this often determined the direction everything would take, and he did not want to reveal any unnecessary reaction. Jamal stood straight, his feet firmly planted on the concrete floor. He did not step back, nor did he move forward. When Elena paused to catch her breath, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You don't trust me." Elena let out a short, sharp laugh. "Of course," she replied, her eyes filled with contempt. "I trust the system. I trust the money I put in. I don't trust a mechanic." Jamal nodded lightly, as if he had anticipated the answer. "You refuse to believe that your money has been taken advantage of," he continued. "That is what you are avoiding." This opposite van. Arthur shifted slightly, his eyes flashing for a brief second. Lily tightened her grip on her mother's hand, her fingers trembling. The child clearly felt the tension. Even though she did not understand every word, Elena turned to look at her daughter, then looked back at Jamal, her expression wavering between anger and confusion. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Elena said, her voice rising. "Do you know who I am?" "I know you are a mother," Jamal replied, "and I know your child is hurting because something was done wrong." Elena stepped forward one step, the distance between them narrowing. "Are you teaching me how to be a mother?" she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Do you think a few minutes in this garage are enough to deny years of treatment?" Jamal did not avoid her gaze. "I think those few minutes are enough for the body to say what paperwork does not," he replied. "You have already seen it." "Ibel." Elena spun around, looking up at the camera screen that was still on. The image showed Lily standing up and running again. She reached out and turned off the screen, the motion decisive. "I don't need to watch it again," she said. "I don't need you to remind me." Arthur spoke for the first time after a long while. "Elena," he said in a low voice, "we should leave. This is not appropriate to resolve here." Elena nodded, but her eyes remained locked on Jamal. "Do you think you've won?" she asked. "Do you think a few sentences can shake me?" Jamal shook his head slightly. "I'm not here to win," he said. "I'm here because I can't pretend to see." Lily gently tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom," the girl said softly, "I feel better." Elena bent down to look at her daughter, her expression softening for a brief moment, then hardening again, as if to protect herself. "Be quiet," she said, her voice not harsh but full of tension. "Mom is handling it." Jamal watched the scene, a familiar feeling rising within him. He had said similar words to his own son during moments of helplessness, and he understood the cost of prolonged silence. He turned back to Elena. "You can leave," he said, "but the truth will not leave with you." Elena froze for a very brief moment. Arthur noticed the hesitation, and his expression darkened. Vic glanced up, then quickly lowered his gaze again, as if afraid that looking too long would pull him into the vortex. "That's enough," Elena said, her voice lower, as if reclaiming control. "I'm not here to listen to a sermon." "I'm not preaching," Jamal replied. "I'm saying what I see." Elena turned her back and signaled to the assistant. Lily was guided toward the door, her hands still clenched tightly. Before leaving completely, Elena stopped, without turning around. "You will not interfere anymore?" she said. "This is the last time." Jamal did not answer immediately. When Elena took another step, he spoke slowly, clearly enough for her to hear. "You can leave this garage," he said, "but the question will follow you." Elena stopped completely. She turned her head and looked at Jamal once more. Her eyes no longer held only anger. Mixed within was a thin trace of doubt. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then stopped. Arthur gently placed his hand on her arm, signaling her to leave. The garage door opened, and light from outside poured in. Elena stepped out, her face still tense, but her steps slower than before. When the door closed, the noise of the garage returned, but the feeling from moments earlier did not fade. Jamal remained standing, exhaling slowly. He knew he had just spoken a sentence that could not be taken back. "Do you stand with Jamal or Elena? Comment Sudat Haitian and follow to see who will collapse next." Outside, Elena stopped beside the car, her hand resting on the door for a moment. She did not look back, but the words she had just heard began to repeat in her mind, like a small scratch on the familiar surface of power. She got into the car, the door closed, and the engine started. The Rolls-Royce drove away, leaving behind a garage full of silence and a doubt that had just begun to eat away from the inside. The private hospital sat on the edge of downtown Detroit, separated from the noisy neighborhoods by glass fencing and a spotless, stone-paved entrance. The place carried a faint sense scent of disinfectant, evenly spaced white lighting, and everything was arranged to create a sense of safety. Arthur Blackwood walked ahead, his steps steady, as if he were familiar with every corridor. Elena pushed Lily's wheelchair behind him, her hands firmly on the handles, her face tense, yet maintaining her habitual composure. The girl sat still, her legs fixed in braces, her eyes following the figures passing by without lingering on any of them. "You can't let a mechanic decide your daughter's fate," Arthur said as they passed the reception desk, his voice low but clear enough for Elena to hear. "What happened at the garage was an incident. Here, you'll get the right answers. Obtur." Elena did not respond immediately. She looked at the doctor's nameplates lining the wall, long academic titles printed in bold black letters against white backgrounds. She told herself she was doing what was necessary, that this was the logical step after a moment of chaos. Lily shifted slightly, a soft scraping sound coming from the brace. Elena tightened her grip for a moment, then continued pushing the wheelchair. The examination room door opened. Dr. Thomas rose from behind his desk, tall, salt and pepper hair neatly combed. He stepped forward and extended his hand, his smile polite but his eyes cold. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "I hear you allowed an unlicensed individual to interfere with your daughter's medical device." Elena shook his hand, her grip firm. "She stood up," she replied, her voice sharp and quick, as if trying to hold on to that fact before it could be dismissed. Thomas tilted his head, his smile fading slightly. "Standing for a few seconds is an accident," he said evenly, "not recovery. Such reactions often occur when the body is stimulated incorrectly." He turned to Lily and bent down to her eye level. "You feel pain, don't you?" Thomas said, his voice softer but not warm. "Pain is normal. Everyone experiences pain during this process." Lily clenched her hands and looked down at the floor. She did not answer. Elena watched her daughter, then looked back at Thomas. "I have paid you millions of dollars," she said, her voice tightening, "so I wouldn't have to listen to vague explanations." Thomas straightened, his gaze locking onto Elena. "And you will continue to pay," he said, not raising his voice but speaking with finality. "If you don't want your daughter permanently disabled because of ignorant interference." Arthur stood slightly behind them and nodded faintly, as if confirming every word. "You see," he added, "we need to rely on expertise." Elena took a deep breath, the pressure closing in on her unmistakably. She turned to Lily. "How do you feel?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Lily looked up, her lips pressed together. "It hurts," she said softly, "but I'm used to it." The answer made Elena pause. Thomas quickly stepped in. "Exactly," he said. "The body adapts. That is the price for the future." Elena turned to him, her eyes sharp. "My daughter's future is not an abstract concept," she said. "She is the child sitting right here." Thomas nodded, as if he had heard that line many times before. "And that is why you need me," he replied, "not people outside the profession." He pulled a chair closer and gestured for Elena to sit. On the screen behind him, X-ray images appeared, lines, annotations, charts. Thomas pointed to each area, explaining in dense technical language. He spoke of axes, of force, of long-term recovery potential. Every sentence ended with a warning, and every warning painted a dire scenario if she strayed from the prescribed path. "Elena," Arthur spoke up when Thomas paused, "you can see it yourself. What happened at the garage was a risk." Elena looked at the screen, then at Lily. The girl sat motionless, her eyes weary. Elena felt herself being pulled along by a powerful current where every choice was already framed. She remembered the moment Lily stood up, remembered that brief shock of possibility. But here, everything had reasons, terminology, and stamped certainty. "So, what are you saying I should do?" Elena asked quietly. Thomas did not hesitate. "Continue the treatment plan," he said. "Increase stabilization. Minimize all uncontrolled interventions, and stay absolutely away from that mechanic." Elena nodded slowly. "You guarantee this?" she asked. Thomas looked straight at her. "I take responsibility," he said, "as I have from the beginning." Arthur placed a light hand on the back of Elena's chair, a small gesture heavy with implication. This is the safe path. The meeting ended faster than Elena expected. They left the examination room, the hallway still bright, everything still orderly. Lily was wheeled out, the brace tightened further according to instructions. On the way home, Elena looked out through the window, the city passing by like a distant, unfamiliar painting. She told herself she had done the right thing, that the unease in her chest was merely the aftermath of a tense situation. By the time they reached the mansion, night had fallen. Lily was taken upstairs to her room. Elena stood watching her for a moment before leaving, her mind still spinning with the words she had just heard. In the spacious living room, she poured herself a glass of water and tried to breathe deeply. Everything seemed to have been put back in its proper place. But as night settled in, the silence of the house was broken by a familiar sound, a soft groan, then another. Elena sprang to her feet and hurried toward the stairs. The higher she climbed, the clearer the sound became, metal scraping against bone, dry and grating. She opened Lily's bedroom door. The girl lay curled up, sweat beading on her forehead, her hands gripping the bedsheets tightly. "It hurts," Lily said very softly, as if afraid of disturbing anyone. Elena sat down beside the bed, her heart pounding. "The doctor said you would get used to it," she replied, though her own voice sounded strange to her. Lily shook her head weakly. "I am used to it," she said, "but it still hurts." Elena looked at the brace, the straps pulled tighter than before. She recalled Thomas's words, remembered that unwavering gaze. She placed her hand on her daughter's forehead, feeling the heat. In that moment, a thin doubt crept in, small but sharp. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the clinic windows, Elena found herself facing Thomas again in her memory. His words echoed clearly, cold and unquestionable. "Only I am right. He said that piece." That conclusion hung in the air, heavy, like a door just closed, forcing Elena to stand before a choice she was not yet ready to name. The mansion sank into silence after midnight. Rows of softly glowing lights lined the long hallways, reflecting off the polished stone floors and creating a sense of order so precise it felt almost emotionless. Elena walked slowly through the living room, holding a phone whose screen had been dark for a long time. She set it down on the table and told herself that every decision she had made that day was reasonable, that she had listened to experts, that the path she had chosen was safe. The thought repeated like a mantra, enough to keep her breathing steady for a few minutes. Then she heard it, a dry, brief sound, like metal touching something hard. It was not loud, but it unmistakably echoed through the night. Elena stopped. She stood still in the hallway, listening. The sound came again, clearer this time, followed by a very small groan, so tightly restrained it nearly vanished. Elena turned toward Lily's room. She moved forward, each step slower, as if afraid of breaking the fragile quiet. The closer she got, the clearer the sound became, metal scraping against bone, dry, regular, like an unavoidable movement. The groan followed, very faint, as if the person making it was accustomed to keeping it as low as possible. Elena stopped in front of the door. Her hand rested on the doorknob, hesitating for a moment. She knew she was about to see something, but she was not yet ready to name it. She pushed the door open. The soft yellow glow of the night lamp fell over the small bed. Lily lay on her side, her back to the door, both legs fixed in braces. The thin blanket had been pulled aside, exposing tightly fastened straps. Sweat soaked her forehead, her hair clinging to her skin. A faint groan escaped her, then stopped immediately, as if Lily had just remembered that she should not make noise. "Are you in pain?" Elena asked, her voice low, struggling to remain calm. Lily turned her head slightly. Her eyes opened, her gaze tired but alert. She shook her head very lightly. "I'm used to it," Lily said, her voice so soft it nearly blended into the air. The answer made Elena falter. She stepped closer and sat on the edge of the bed. "Since when?" she asked, her voice catching despite her effort to keep it even. Lily stared at the ceiling for a moment, as if searching her memory. "Since they said pain is normal," she replied. "They said if I get used to it, I'll think about it less." Elena swallowed hard. Those words carried no resentment, no tears. They were spoken like a truth repeated often enough to become self-evident. She reached out and touched her daughter's shoulder, feeling the small body tense beneath the fabric of her sleepwear. "Did the doctors say that?" Elena asked. Lily nodded very slightly. "They said if I complain too much, it means I'm not trying hard enough." Elena leaned closer. She looked at the braces, the dull metal bars, the straps tightened more than they had been that afternoon. She remembered meeting Thomas, remembered how he spoke of adaptation, of the price that had to be paid. Those terms, placed next to her daughter's body, felt stark and hollow. "Do you want me to loosen them?" Elena asked, her hand hovering over the straps. Lily flinched slightly. "No," she said more quickly than before. "They said not to touch them. If they shift, it'll hurt more." "Is one?" Elena withdrew her hand. She sat there, looking at her child as a wave of helplessness rose within her. She was used to solving everything with decisive choices, with power and money. But here, those tools were useless. The pain remained, present and undeniable, impossible to negotiate with. Lily let out another soft groan, then tried to suppress it. Elena wrapped her arms around Lily, pulling Lily close. The girl's body curled inward by reflex, a small movement, but enough for Elena to feel the discomfort clearly. Even while being held, Lily remained tense, as if her body had learned to protect itself even from comforting gestures. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, unsure whom she was speaking to. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Lily did not answer. She simply breathed a little more evenly, her head resting against her mother's shoulder, but her legs remained fixed in place, the braces still tightly fastened. The sound of metal scraping against bone came again, very faint, but enough for Elena to hear. Elena closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, images from earlier that day surfaced. The garage under harsh white lights, Jamal kneeling in front of Lily, the way he had looked at the braces, the way Lily had stood for that brief moment. At the time, Elena had dismissed it, called it risk, impulsiveness. Now, in this room, those arguments felt weak. "Mom," Lily whispered, "I'm okay." Those words hurt Elena more than any accusation. She opened her eyes and looked at her daughter's face. It was the face of a child who had learned to reassure adults, who was accustomed to minimizing her own needs so as not to be a burden. "No," Elena said, her voice breaking. "You shouldn't have to endure this." She bent down and examined the braces again. For the first time, she looked at them not as medical devices, but as foreign objects bound tightly to her child's body. The straps looked like restraints. The metal bars held Lily's body in an unnatural position. The thought made Elena's scalp prickle. Elena held her daughter closer, carefully, afraid of causing more pain. Lily breathed softly, unevenly, but without crying out. Her body remained curled inward, even while being protected. The sight etched itself into Elena's mind, clearer than any warning ever could. She sat there for a long time, not checking the clock. In her head, Thomas's words echoed, precise and cold. "Only I am right." At that moment, the statement no longer felt reassuring. It sounded like a command demanding obedience, leaving no room for questions. Elena looked down at the braces once more. For the first time, they seemed more like instruments of torture than tools of healing. The thought made her shudder. She placed her hand on the metal, feeling the cold seep into her skin. It was not a vague fear, but a slow, heavy realization. In the quiet night of the mansion, the truth did not need to shout. It was there, in the faint groans, in the curled body of a child, in the look of practiced endurance. Elena understood that there were things she could no longer block out, and in that moment, even without being named, the belief she had once placed entirely in power and expertise had begun to fracture. Morning arrived at the garage earlier than usual. The lights were not fully on yet, and the smell of oil still lingered from the night before. Jamal was checking his tools, doing familiar tasks to keep his rhythm. He did not think much about yesterday, because if he did, the heaviness in his chest would return. In this place, continuing to work was the only way not to be pulled into things he had no right to control. The garage door opened. There was no convoy of cars, no one clearing the way ahead. Elena Hargrove walked in alone. She wore no sunglasses and carried no sense of urgency. Her steps were slow, her shoulders slightly slumped, as if the night before had taken something that had always kept her standing straight. Lily followed behind in her wheelchair, silent, her hands resting neatly on her lap. Arthur appeared last, keeping his distance, his gaze alert, but lacking its usual confidence. Elena stopped in front of Jamal. The distance between them was close enough that she did not need to raise her voice. She looked at him for a few seconds, as if weighing every word. "I came back because I need you," Elena said, her voice low, without command. Jamal set his tools down and wiped his hands. He looked up, his expression calm. "Do you need a miracle, or do you need the truth?" he asked. The question carried no challenge, but it was enough to reset their positions. Elena swallowed. She glanced toward Lily, then back at him. "If you believe the problem is in the brace," she said slowly, "then check it." Jamal nodded slightly. "I will," he replied, "but you have to look carefully." Arthur stepped forward half a pace, his voice tense. "You're making a mistake," he said. "We've already listened to specialists." Elena turned sharply. "Be quiet," she said, more decisive than ever before. "This time, I'm listening to the person standing in front of me." Arthur froze. He stepped back, his eyes flicking quickly over Jamal before settling on Lily. The girl looked up at Jamal, a clear plea in her eyes. There were no tears, only a fragile hope of being acknowledged. Jamal stepped closer and knelt in front of Lily. "I'll go slowly," he said. "If anything feels uncomfortable, you tell me." Lily nodded very slightly. Elena stood just behind her, her hands clasped together, trying to stay calm. She knew this moment would decide many things, and there was no way back. Jamal placed his hands on the brace, feeling the pressure. He began to remove it, strap by strap. Arthur glanced at his watch, then around, as if reminding everyone of time and risk. But Elena did not turn back. Her eyes were fixed on every movement Jamal made, as if she were seeing a process for the first time, one she had previously only delegated. "What are you doing?" Arthur asked quietly. "Letting the body speak," Jamal replied, without looking up. He removed the outer layer, revealing metal joints and compression pads. Jamal paused at one point, his hand stopping very briefly. Elena noticed the change. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Jamal did not answer immediately. He adjusted the position and observed Lily's reaction. The girl frowned, then exhaled. "It feels better," Lily said softly. Elena tightened her hands. She looked at Arthur, then back at Jamal. "Continue," she said. Jamal went on. Each screw that came out was accompanied by a small truth. Incorrect angles, misaligned axes, and padding that compressed soft tissue too much. He did not need to say much, because Lily's body responded before any explanation was spoken. Her breathing became more even, her shoulders less tense. Arthur stepped closer. "Stop," he said. "This needs a clinic." Elena turned to him, her gaze firm. "You've said enough," she replied. "I'm seeing it. It's nasadum to this rever." Jamal looked up at Elena. "Do you see?" he said, pointing at the joint. "This isn't a mistake. It holds the body in a state of incorrect load-bearing." Elena bent down to look more closely. She was not an engineer, but she could see the marks on Lily's skin, the red impressions where metal had pressed in. "Why would they do this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jamal took a deep breath. "So, the treatment never ends," he said. "When pain becomes normal, people stop asking questions." Arthur shook his head. "That's speculation." "No," Elena said, cutting him off. "This is what I'm seeing." Jamal finished removing the brace. He set the parts aside neatly. Lily looked down at her legs, then at Jamal. "Can I stand?" she asked. "Not yet," Jamal replied. "We need to check first." He repositioned her, measured her center of gravity, and tested joint angles. Elena followed every step, her mind tense but focused. She realized she was learning to see differently, no longer relying on titles or signs. Arthur stood still, his hands clenched. He understood that control was slipping out of his grasp, not through argument, but through being forced to witness. Jamal nodded at Lily. "All right," he said. "Now try standing." Lily placed her hands on the armrests and shifted her weight. Elena stepped forward, ready to support her. Jamal kept just enough distance. Lily lifted herself slowly and tremblingly. She stood, slightly leaning, but her face did not tighten with pain. A long breath escaped her. "It doesn't hurt," Lily said, as if she could not believe herself. Elena raised a hand to cover her mouth. She did not cry, but her eyes were wet. She looked at Jamal, then at her daughter. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jamal nodded. "This is just the beginning," he replied. "The truth will go much further." It sunned. Arthur stepped back and took out his phone, as if trying to regain control in his usual way. Elena turned to him. "You don't need to call anyone," she said. "Not yet." Arthur looked at her, unease showing for the first time. He lowered the phone. Jamal fully removed the brace and placed it on the table. The metal lightly struck against itself, a short, dry sound. Elena looked at the object, feeling as if she were staring at evidence. She took a deep breath, understanding that the decision she had made that morning had pushed her onto a different path, one where power was no longer a shield. If it were you, would you dare to lower your ego to save your child? Comment "dare" and follow to see how the truth will be revealed. Jamal bent down and continued checking, while Elena stood still, her eyes never leaving her daughter's legs. From the moment Jamal began removing the brace, the atmosphere in the garage had changed. It was no longer a place for fixing cars, but a place where a truth was being uncovered, layer by layer, slowly and irreversibly. Jamal pulled the metal table closer and placed the dismantled brace on its flat surface. The garage lights shone down on every exposed detail, now laid bare, no longer hidden beneath the shell of medical terminology. He took a deep breath and adjusted his posture, exactly the way he always did when working on a complex machine. To him, this was not a foreign device. It was a load-bearing structure, and every structure tells the truth if you know how to look at it. Elena stood close beside him, saying nothing. She watched Jamal's hands move, steady and precise. Arthur stood behind them, silent, but his eyes never left each motion, as if he were counting down to something about to shatter. Jamal began remeasuring the joint angle. He placed the gauge against the knee axis, straightened it, and memorized the measurement. "The center of gravity is forced downward," he said evenly. "Not to support, but to press." 18's9. He removed each screw one by one, setting them neatly aside. The sound of metal lightly striking the tabletop was dry and sharp. With every screw that came free, another layer of control was stripped away. Jamal carefully examined the padding, pressing lightly with his finger against the contact area. The padding compressed deeper than necessary, leaving a clearly defined indentation. "This area compresses the soft tissue excessively," he said. "The body responds with pain." End quote. Elena raised a hand to her mouth, unable to speak. She looked toward Lily, who sat in the wheelchair, her bare legs resting on the cushion, for the first time not bound in place. Lily followed every movement, her eyes wide, as if witnessing a secret being exposed. Jamal continued dismantling the inner components. When he reached the internal metal layer, his hands slowed. It was a brief moment, almost imperceptible, but Elena noticed. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jamal did not answer right away. He tilted his head and looked more closely. A metal bar had been set off from the standard axis, not misaligned from wear or improper assembly. It was firmly fixed in a position that ensured the force constantly pulled the body into a state of tension. He pointed to it. "Here," Jamal said slowly, each word clearly separated. "This is not an error." Elena swallowed hard. "You mean?" she asked, her voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. Jamal looked up directly at her. "If it were a mistake," he said, "it would be random. This is consistent. It keeps the child in pain, so the process never truly ends." Arthur stepped forward. "You're speculating," he said tensely. "Medical devices don't operate like your machines." Jamal turned to Arthur. "Anything that bears a load follows principles," he replied. "The human body is no different." Elena stepped closer, staring at the misaligned metal bar. She reached out, then stopped midway. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I am," Jamal answered, "because if it were aligned correctly, the child would not have been in pain all this time." The space around them grew heavy. Lily moved her legs slightly, without the accompanying sound of metal. She looked at her mother, then at Jamal. "So, I wasn't in pain because I'm weak?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. Jamal turned back to her, his expression softer. "No," he said. "You were in pain because someone did something wrong." Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, they were red. "A trap," she repeated, as if testing the sound of an unfamiliar word. "You're saying this is a trap?" Jamal nodded. "A design that makes the person wearing it dependent forever." Arthur stepped back half a step. For the first time, the confidence in his stance cracked. "We need to take this to the hospital," he said, but his voice was no longer firm. Elena spun around sharply. "Enough," she said. "I can see it now." She looked back at the brace, each separated piece lying on the table, no longer a whole protected by reputation. In her mind, images of payments, contracts, and familiar reassurances followed one another, then broke apart. "That's impossible," Elena whispered, her voice faltering. Those words were not a denial of Jamal, but a rejection of the very belief she had once fully embraced. Jamal stood still, knowing that this moment required silence more than further explanation. Before them, the metal lay exposed, unadorned, and incapable of lying. And once the trap had been revealed, there was no way to hide it again. Jamal returned home when night had already fallen. The small apartment greeted him with the familiar smell of metal and grease clinging to his sleeves. He set his bag down on the table, took out the sketches he had quickly drawn from memory, and spread them across the scratched surface. The yellow light shone down, just bright enough to reveal every line he had, drawn straight lines corrected to the proper axis, angled lines brought back into balance. This was no longer about fixing a device. This was about giving a body back to itself. His son sat in the corner of the room, his legs resting quietly on the cushion. The boy looked at his father, then at the sheets of paper. "Who are you making this for?" he asked, his voice curious. Jamal looked up and smiled very faintly. "For another child," he replied. The boy nodded, thought for a moment, then said with certainty, "You can do it." Those words touched Jamal in a deeply personal way. He did not answer, only reached out to rub his son's head, then turned back to the work table. He used his savings to buy materials, one item at a time, not abundant, but enough. He knew that every dollar there was meant for his own child, and for that very reason, he allowed himself no carelessness. That night, he worked without stopping, measuring, cutting, assembling, taking things apart, then putting them back together again. Each time he heard metal strike against metal, he remembered the dry scraping sound in the night at the mansion and adjusted things just a little more. When the new brace was finished, it looked simple, unadorned. There was no logo, no title, only a correct structure, with the center of gravity placed where the body needed it, no forcing, no coercion. Jamal placed his hand on it, checked it one final time, then leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Dawn was near. The day of the trial came faster than he expected. The room in the garage was cleared out, and the lights were switched on. Elena arrived early, saying little. Lily sat in the wheelchair, her eyes filled with both anticipation and caution. Arthur stood at a distance, silent, like someone forced to witness something he could not control. Jamal pushed the table closer and placed the new brace on it. "We go slowly," he said. "No rush." Elena nodded. "I am here," she replied. "I am watching." Again, Jamal knelt in front of Lily, explaining each step, no technical terms, no commands. He placed the brace in the correct position, adjusted each strap and each joint. Lily bit her lip, waiting for the familiar sensation to crash down on her, but it did not come. She opened her eyes, looked down at her legs, then looked at Jamal. "It feels different," Lily said hesitantly. "Yes," Jamal replied. "Different is right." He stepped back one pace. "Try standing." "Say." Lily placed her hands on the armrests and shifted her weight. Elena stepped forward half a step, then stopped, as if afraid to disturb the moment. Lily lifted herself. Her knees trembled slightly, but they did not collapse. There was no groan, no sound of metal scraping against bone, only quickened breathing from nervous excitement. Lily was standing. She remained still for a few seconds, as if checking each signal from her body. "It does not hurt," Lily said, her voice breaking with astonishment. Jamal nodded. "Take one step," he said. Lily lifted her foot and set it down. One step. The room fell completely silent. Elena raised a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. Lily took a deep breath and stepped forward again. The second step was steadier than the first. She turned to look at her mother, a smile breaking through before the tears could come. Elena could not hold herself together any longer. She burst into tears, unrestrained, unhidden. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter, careful yet trembling. "Does it hurt?" Elena asked, her voice cracking. Lily shook her head very slightly. "Not like before," she answered. Elena held her tighter, feeling that Lily's body no longer tensed within her embrace. For the first time in many years, the hug carried no defense. "I am sorry," Elena said, the two heavy words falling between them. Lily wrapped her arms around her mother in return. "I know you just wanted me to be okay," she said. Jamal stepped back, keeping his distance. He watched the scene before him, a sense of relief mixed with something sharper. This was the moment of giving a body back to a child, but he knew it did not end there. Elena wiped her tears and turned to Jamal. "Thank you," she said hoarsely. "You gave my child something my money could not." Jamal shook his head. "I only put it back the right way," he replied. Arthur stood motionless, his face rigid. He understood that what had just happened could not be undone. Elena turned to him. Her gaze changed. No longer dependence, but a new resolve is taking shape. "You know what you have done," she said quietly, "and I will not let this end here." Arthur did not respond. Lily sat down to rest, her smile still there. Jamal gathered his tools and set the old brace aside. The old metal struck against itself, a short sound, like a period marking the end of a chapter. Elena looked back at her daughter, then at Jamal. The tears on her face had not yet dried, but her eyes were different. No longer the softness of a mother who had just been saved, but the focus of someone who had just seen the truth. Those tears, when they fell onto the cold concrete floor, did not disappear. They quietly accumulated, silently transformed. And when Elena lifted her head, there was fire in her gaze. Elena did not wait for another night. Immediately after the trial session, when Lily was sleeping peacefully without groaning in pain, she sat alone in her office. In front of her lay the stacks of files that had once been signed with absolute trust. The power she had once used to flatten poor neighborhoods, the power that had once forced others into silence, was now redirected, not to threaten, but to trace backward. An independent investigation was launched quietly, yet decisively, with no press releases and no grand public declarations. The flow of money began to be tracked. The so-called consulting invoices from Dr. Thomas surfaced, dense and regular to an abnormal degree. Expenses that were not tied to any specific treatment case, contracts extended indefinitely, and clauses that bound patients so tightly they could not leave. The investigative team laid everything side by side, each piece fitting together in a way that could not be denied. What Jamal had seen with his eyes and felt with his hands was now confirmed by data. Thomas was summoned. The first time he stepped into the interrogation room, he maintained his familiar demeanor, back straight, voice confident. But when the invoices were placed on the table, when the money trail was projected onto the screen, that certainty began to fracture. "This is procedure," Thomas said, his voice no longer as steady as before. "Medicine requires time." Elena's lawyer sat across from him, not raising his voice. "Who introduced you to these patients?" he asked. Thomas was silent for a few seconds, long enough for beads of sweat to appear on his forehead. He glanced at the documents, then down at the table. "Arthur Blackwood," Thomas said, his voice growing hoarse. "He made the connections. A better." The name landed in the meeting room like a heavy object. Phone calls were extracted, and private meetings confirmed. The network became clearer than any defense could ever be. Arthur was no longer standing in the shadows. On the day Arthur was arrested, he was at his private villa. His suit was still perfectly pressed, his familiar controlled smile still on his lips when the door opened. But this time, no one stood behind him to protect him. When the handcuffs closed, Arthur stared straight ahead, offering no resistance and saying nothing. That silence was no longer power. It was a full stop. Elena appeared before the public a few days later. No glamorous backdrop, no polished messaging. She stood before the microphone, her gaze steady. "I believed money could buy safety," she said. "I closed my eyes to a system that caused pain to my own child. I am sorry." It was not a public relations apology. There were no carefully refined words meant to soften responsibility. She announced a corrective care support program for underprivileged children, delivered directly to communities, without passing through any intermediary networks that had previously existed. "No one should have to get used to pain to be called someone with a future," Elena said. In the crowd below, Jamal stood among the others. He did not step onto the stage, did not accept praise. He stood upright, his feet firmly planted, just as he had stood from the first day in the garage. When Elena's gaze passed over him, she gave a very slight nod. Not an act of granting favor, but an acknowledgement. Lily stood beside her mother, no longer wearing the old brace. The girl held Elena's hand, her legs resting naturally beneath her. There was no metal sound, no familiar stiffness. Jamal saw it, and for him, that was enough. Life at the garage returned to its old rhythm. Vic no longer shouted as before, his eyes avoiding Jamal whenever he passed by. Cars continued to come and go, but Jamal no longer lowered his head. He worked as he always had, but his posture was different. Not because favor had been granted, but because he had claimed his place through truth. If you believe that standing upright is more frightening than violence, comment Yes, and follow, so you do not miss the stories that come next. The story does not end with gunfire or a dramatic arrest scene. It ends with files being turned over, money trails brought into the light, and a father who refused to bow his head. The system did not collapse because of violence, but because there were people who looked straight at it and spoke what they saw.